All right, so that was a fascinating section. Now, in this section, Daniel is going to explain what is a foundation model, and we are going to look into where does the AI get the training data from, and Daniel is going to help us understand when AI models use these training data, does it possess any privacy concerns? Then we are going to learn about how does these AI model continue to get better, and we are going to finish off this section with understanding what does it mean by an AI model training. Enjoy.
So, what is a foundational model? Or we'll often hear it now called a frontier model. But a foundational model is like any of these other models, except it's trained on a large unstructured set of data, input data, and it is not trained to do a specific task. It is trained to take on general purpose tasks. Effectively, we take on the left-hand side, we take huge amounts of training data, usually vast quantities. If you look at something like GPT-3 and 3.5 Turbo, that was trained on something called web text. Web text is a massive open set of data available for anyone to use to train models. That is then produced a foundational or a frontier model, which is actually internally called a GPT. It's a generative pre-trained transformer model. That is the architecture of the model, how it works internally. You don't really need to worry too much about that, but that's how it works internally. And then we take that foundational model and we adapt it to do specific tasks. For example, on the right hand side, we have question answering, or we might have extraction of information, or video generation, or object recognition. So we start with a set of data, we produce a foundational model, and then we make that model adapted to specific tasks. But we might just take the standard one, which is not on here, which is conversation. Uh, ChatGPT, the one you've probably used through OpenAI's ChatGPT, which is the GPT 3.5 Turbo model, or possibly GPT-4. Those models are adapted from the foundational model to be able to chat. Right, that's what they're adapted to do. But there are many
Right.
other models you might have encountered.
Daniel, if I may ask another question. So these foundational models, the first set of data which users, what are the where is this data coming from? Is it from source from internet, or is it like these open AI gather so much text and images, things like that? Like how does how is that unstructured data fed in to the model?
That is a great question. So I mentioned web text. So web
Yeah.
text is scraped from the internet.
Yeah.
I think you can actually go and you can look up on the web text GitHub site. It'll tell you where exactly it gets it from, but essentially it's all the links from Reddit that link to Google. Now,
Oh,
it's
right.
not Reddit content. It's
Yeah.
actually scraped off, and you can go and see that. Now that is publicly available. Now, not all models are trained on web text. It was just, I
Right.
think, the early GPT models used web text, and it's about 45 terabytes of data from off the top of my head.
Right.
I expect newer models use different sets or larger sets, especially as if you're training a large language model that is also a multimodal image model. For example, it can either it can take in images or video or speech. Those models will obviously have a data set that contains those data types.
Right. And these web texts, when they crawl these data, does it impose any privacy concerns and things like that? Because you're technically
It
going and searching data from multiple sources, right?
It does. So there is a well-documented process of how that data is cleaned
Okay.
and made ready. But for newer models or newer closed source models, we don't always, the ones that are trained by OpenAI and other companies, whether how they what data sets they use, how they clean that data, that isn't necessarily provided to us publicly.
Okay.
Other models, some open models, they do provide that, and you can actually look up that. If you go onto someone like Hugging Face, you can actually go and look at how the data was sourced, how it was cleaned, how it was managed.
Okay. Awesome.
But it is a
Thank you.
really important question.
Yeah.
So once we've got a foundation model and an adaptation to that foundational model, that model is available for anyone to use. This is very different to a traditional machine learning model. You might have to fine tune it or tune it yourself or train it yourself. These foundational models are provided as is. So what actually is what do you get when we talk about an LLM? You don't actually get anything. An LLM is just an API that you can call where there is a model behind it. Now that there is a caveat to that. Yes, you can run your own LLMs, you can run them on your own infrastructure, you can deploy them to your local machine even. But when we're talking about these large LLMs from companies like OpenAI, you don't run the model locally yourself. It is provided as a service to you behind an API that you can just
Right.
call. It is just an API.
Right.
Um, but what does that actually mean? There is These models consist of two parts. Essentially, what we call the model weights, which is that bit in the middle there, which contains the neural network that describes the relationship that the model has built to basically what we'll talk about next, predict the next token in a series of tokens, plus some code that tells it how to run inference, or basically how to take the input from a user and give it to the model to get the output. So you don't
Right.
get view on any of that. That is provided to you behind an API. So that's the
Right.
important thing to think here.
One more follow-up question,
Yeah.
Daniel. So once you get access to a model, does that mean the training is complete or the training is constant? The new training is been happening and you always get the trained model. So how does I need to understand that
Another
part.
great question. Yeah, absolutely. So it really depends on the model. For if we
Yeah.
take, say, a model like GPT-3.5 Turbo,
Yeah.
training the model is very expensive and very
Mm.
time consuming.
Right.
We're talking many hundreds of or thousands of hours of GPU time across many hundreds of thousands of GPUs.
Mm.
Um, so they only train it every 3 months or so.
Yeah.
And we only get access to the API. We get to choose the model version we would like to use. That
Yeah.
usually it's got a date on it, um, but it's not that frequently.
Right.
It's That's important to know.
Right.
Um, Even the smaller models are not trained that frequently, simply because the cost of training. This
Okay.
little, we have this training box on the left here in this diagram. That is a large amount of time. That is where most of the time is spent, is building these models.
Right.
And we're
And
talking
when
tens of millions of dollars.
cool. And when you talk about training, training means if they add another set of new data, this neural link has to go and learn the pathways to the new data. Is that the training from
It's
a layman's
exactly
term?
it. Yep. If we change the training data, we've got to run the training process to build the new encode the transformer model,
Okay.
and then readapt it. So all of these other adaptations have to be repeated um, on that newly trained model. So
Okay.
it's an important part of the process is to understand you don't need to do the training, but someone is doing the training, and you need to choose a model and keep your models up to date. Basically, using, you know, the we could talk later about model deprecation processes and things like that, and these are all part of the larger how do you operationalize an AI solution, because you need to worry about how long is my model going to be available? What do I need to do to upgrade to a newer model? How do I evaluate my solution on using a newer model?
Yeah.
So these are all questions we can definitely, I think, are really important to understand down the track.
Okay. Awesome. This is great, Daniel. I love it.
Oh, awesome! I'm glad it's making sense.
Yes.
So yeah,
100%.
the key here is you don't need to train it.
Yep.
OpenAI and other companies have done it for you. You just take the model as is, and it's either run for you and you get an API, or in some cases, you can run it yourself, but you don't train it yourself.
Okay.